I just want to say, I think one thing that I think most organizations have not yet fully added to their plan is reportability. So being able to collect all of the, we'll call it metadata, of who's doing what throughout the response process, who's doing what, when they did it, why they did that, how it correlates to the plan and what you thought you were going to do, why you did that, why you didn't do that, et cetera, so that you can actually track and record the decisions that you made. I think that's something that is a modern reality, because at some point you may have to defend yourself either to a regulator, to a customer, or to a cyber insurance provider why you did what you did. And I think if you don't have the means to collect that data, or that you just simply don't collect it, you're going to be in a worse spot. And I think that's something that's really come to life over the last, say, 12 months.
So CISA produced a product a couple years back. It was the Incident Response Playbook, and it's on our website, CISA.gov. It gives you a great foundation document to be able to put your parts in there to handle things the way you need to in your organization. But going back to his question, it will cover all of the required areas to include reporting, because we all have reporting requirements, whether it's to your board or whether it's to a regulator. It's all covered in that playbook.
One of the things that I think is so important but gets missed in these plans is the relationship between your outside counsel and your service providers, okay? And I imagine many of you are familiar with the whole debacle with Capital One, where they had not engaged outside counsel specifically for a breach that happened. They simply used an existing contract, used an existing provider, which I'm sure was doing a great job, but the problem is that there was no thought about specifically contracting for that incident. And when it happened, Capital One couldn't get attorney-client privilege, which really is so important to establish. Now, you may waive it down the road, but you want to at least have that privilege. You want to have what's called attorney work product, meaning that anything that's produced during that incident, because you want to be able to have that for court, you want to be able to protect that. You don't want the other side to get your after-action report. I've had many unpleasant discussions with opposing counsel about this, because they, in contracts, want a copy of the after-action report. Well, that may be privileged, which means that you may now have to set up a privileged and a non-privileged track whenever you're preparing after-action reports. There's a lot more to this, and I don't think those things get considered when these incident plans are put together. I think hopefully now that's something that will be top of mind.
So Scott, could you go a little bit further on the after-action aspect of the incident response?
Sure. What's going to happen is that typically you're going to want to develop some kind of report about what happened, okay? And that's great. You want to have a report. But here's what's important is that you want to keep that to yourself. And down the road, sure, you may want to share it, but establishing your privilege, okay, having outside counsel get involved, essentially oversee the incident, the response to the incident, to engage on the third party, say it's Mandiant or whoever it is, to be able to get them all under a letter of privilege so that everything that happens under that auspice of privilege. That way, if there is litigation, which inevitably there is going to be, all the things that you're talking about for the purpose of getting legal advice, they're not going to be able to expose that to the rest of the world. Now, again, down the road, sure, the company may have to waive that in order to get out of trouble with the feds, but by and large, protecting that is critical. And so you're going to be developing that report in some form or fashion, or gathering evidence. You want to be able to protect that. You want to be able to at least not have to hand it over to the opposing counsel in a litigation, because you're just essentially doing their job for them. So those two ideas, privilege and attorney work product, it's critical, and it's critical to have that discussion with outside counsel before these things happen, especially for overseas folks, because there's no respect, unfortunately, in Europe for inside counsel. It's only outside counsel that gets that privilege. So that's another dynamic to consider whenever you're putting together your plan.
To add to why the reporting and the after action is so critical, really the planning and then feeding back into your loop can definitely reduce the amount of financial impact that you might have. If you are able to show a regulator the steps that you took during the incident and how you responded, those items are taken into account as they're looking at whether or not you're going to be sanctioned. But in addition, if you've had a similar incident and then you took steps to prevent something and then you have another incident of a similar type, being able to show, well, these are the steps and this was a failure of an individual to follow as opposed to a failure of the program or a technology failure or something like that. So, and then also mentioning the service providers that you have on tap. If you already have that, you can negotiate ahead of time for mitigation services so that when you have to stand up your call center, you already have the contract, you already have the pricing, you're not, you negotiated that ahead of time. And so I can tell you from experience that you can reduce your cost by about 2/3 on a large incident.
I got a question for Steve now. We all have vendors that we use on our network to allow our network to function. So what is the obligation of vendors or service level agreements that we should have in place for incident response?
Well, I mean, I think the service level agreement itself is probably specific to your organization and your business, but at the same time, I think the point is to have a service level agreement. What exactly that is really up to the org, but I think having it is really important. One of the things that we've found is that people just simply forget who their outside vendors are and that they need to be incorporated into the response plan. That there's no means for them all to have access to the plan. I think that's really, like, at some level, like, if you're going to be dependent on your outside counsel or your MSP, your incident response provider, you want them to action their actions on your plan, not whatever they're planning to do. So I think just having them, identifying which vendors they are, and then incorporating them not only through an SLA but also through the actions. The other thing I would just say is that now with reporting, it's not just what your team does that may cause reportability, but also what your vendors do. And so what that means is if your outsourced vendor is having a cyber attack, you may have to make a decision on whether or not that means you're having a cyber attack. And so you want to be able to really think about the reporting chain across the entire supply chain of your vendors. For example, if you have an outsourced factory and that factory's outsourced IT provider is having a cyber attack, does that mean you're having a cyber attack? Well, in some cases it does, and in some cases it might not. And so being able to discern that ahead of time is probably going to be pretty important for your ability to report in a timely manner, to make the right decisions. Now, what we do see is that some organizations have very tight reporting windows. So I'm aware of at least one New York money center bank that requires its most important vendors to report a cyber attack within 4 hours, which is a very tight window. And so if your customer happens to be this bank, you may have to have a 4-hour reporting window. So now what that means is not only do you have to report to them based on that SLA, but anybody that is a vendor to you now has to report to you in a certain manner so that you can report to them in that same SLA. So really it takes a lot of thought and I would say preparation to determine what is the right flow of information from your vendors to you, how do you make that decision, and then how do you flow it back to your customer.
One of the most important tools you can have to get inside that 4-hour window is a data inventory. And those of you involved in privacy and personal data are already well versed with that. But a data inventory, sometimes it's called records of processing activities in the EU, but it's basically a directory of all of the controlled data you have within your organization, where it is, who's responsible for it, what kind of controls are in place. I used to build those as part of my job. I was with a consulting firm some years ago, and it's amazing how detailed they can get. And when you build those things out, what's interesting is you ask all kinds of questions like, where is the server that holds this data? And who has access to it? And where are all the data flows? And where does it, and what other applications does it flow through? You'll find that you're going to be missing a lot of data that's chained to other data. So maybe you have an HR system that's plugged into an LMS, that's plugged into an expense management system, that's et cetera, et cetera. You're going to find there are all kinds of things you didn't realize are there. having that data inventory is critical, because then you're going to be able, as soon as something bad happens, to be able to get an idea, okay, these servers are likely implicated. That means this data is mapped to this server. Therefore, we have a fairly good idea inside a 4-hour window of what the scope is, at least by an order of magnitude, and you can give something useful to not just your business partners, but to the authorities, and look like you're on top of the problem.
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, one of the examples that you might have is your IT staff might have gotten a report of an incident, and it's a SAP system or something like that. And so they're thinking, well, it's mostly manufacturing, et cetera. We don't have any other types of data in it, but really you do. You have your customer data, with the know your customer rules and having to vet customers most of the time. You have detailed information, and even though it's business contact, if it's Europeans, that's breach reportable data. So being able to say this system has this type of data, and so that was something that not just the record of processing to satisfy GDPR, but just to know your assets, what data is in what systems, and who should have access to it. That helps with all kinds of security aspects, and highly recommend making that inventory and taking the time for that step.
So Marie, quick question for you. How important, in what you just said, how important is to classify your data in advance?
It's pretty important to have a governance structure that lets people know this type of data has this type of regulation associated with it. And so having a data classification schema at your company is really key.
If I can add to that, I spent about 2 years at a defense contractor, and part of my job was managing controlled unclassified information, which now is something that it's certainly much more prevalent than it was way back when. And data classification is invaluable. Just for that, if that was your only use case, controlled unclassified information, and you wanted a justification to do data classification, look no further. Because I can tell you that the folks at DoD and state and all the other 3-letter agencies have a very short fuse when it comes to mishandling data that is contractually obligated theirs, directly or indirectly. And that alone was enough reason for us to establish a data classification system, which ultimately is how I wound up at Spirion. It's kind of a bit of an irony there, but that was the happy outcome. I'm sure the data and everything else was well protected, but the fact that I got a job was just a bonus, I think.
So I just wanted to add to this whole thing is that CISA produces an assessment that we do called the External Dependencies Management Assessment, where it allows you to step back and look at all the dependencies that influence your mission, but that you don't have control over, suppliers, vendors, and allows you to think of your cybersecurity resilience requirements and trying to apply those to contracts, SLAs, and any sort of agreements you have. As an example, imagine a vendor that has to reach into your network through a VPN, putting in the contract to say you must have MFA on all of the accounts that you're using to touch my network. Things like that. That's what the EDM pushes for and gives you that insight. A lot of us have never thought that way, and then to be able to work with the contracting folks to get them to change some of that language. That's what the EDM does. So if you're interested, your organization's interested, hit me up after this and we can get you signed up.
One last thought is, Marie kind of spurred an idea for me, and something that Scott said, which is, being able to establish privilege, at least in the United States, is very important, so that you can segment, the information that you're sharing and how you have to share it with your attorney. You can kind of cover yourself in the United States, as long as you take action on that at the beginning. And the problem with that is that at the beginning of an incident, you might not know if the incident is actually a security incident or a basic IT operational incident. And so being able to really think about how you will integrate IT operations incidents with your security incidents might be something very important to you, because being able to establish that U.S. privilege, that legal privilege, requires certain kinds of processes You want to be able to make sure you're following those processes for every single incident, whether you think it's an IT or you think it's a security incident, because if it later on turns out that it is in fact a security incident, you're going to be happy that you followed the process from the beginning.
And an earlier question was, who do you have on your response teams? And when you're exercising them, a really important group to have at the table is your help desk, because a lot of times people will call the help desk thinking it is just some sort of glitch with their system. And then it turns out it's a huge incident. And it was days before it got the notice of the true group that should have responded. So having your help desk and having scripts for them to make sure that they get the right people involved as soon as they get that first call.
That's an interesting point. So Cygnus is basically makes it so that you can have your incident response plan and your contacts in your pocket. It comes as an app. But where I thought that was interesting is that we have someone on my team who runs our customer success team. And she told me this story that she worked at a large software firm previously, and they were all required as customer support people to have the incident response plan with them at all times. And so I asked her, how did she do that? She says, well, I printed it off. I had one from my desk, I had one from my house, and I had one from my briefcase. And I said, well, that's great. And when did you print it off? She says, the first day I started. I said, how long did you work there? She said, 6 years. I said, and how often did you print it off? She says, right. And so being able to have that, not just to your incident response team, but to really everybody who is going to be part of this, of the chain of determining or responding to an incident, I think is very important.
So let's build on that one, is talk about what are the common failings of incident response process. Or let me rephrase it. The Cygnus platform does some things so we don't screw it up on our own.
Yeah.
So let's talk about that way.
Yeah, I mean, I think, one of the most, I thought, compelling stories that I heard was I have a CISO that I've been working with. They've been running quarterly tabletop exercises. They have a plan. They exercise the plan. They're doing the right things in general. But this executive's CEO, who does participate in these quarterly exercises, good for them, came to him and said, look, I think this is pretty interesting. I actually don't mind doing this. I find it kind of clandestine. It's cool to do this. But there's no way I'm going to remember what to do in the moment of an actual crisis, because, to be frank, I'm only sort of paying attention. And so in that moment, this CISO was thinking about, well, what do I need to do to make sure that every one of my executives has the playbook on hand that they can access, where they don't have to read a large textbook, but they're getting more information than a Post-it note, and that they can actually get access to the tasks that are assigned to them. Like, what should I be doing in this moment based on where we are in the response? And so that's really where they did actually start working with Cygnus so that they could have all of their executives have their personal plan in their pocket. That really helped to give that confidence to those executives that they actually would be able to execute their incident response plan in that moment.
So I'm going to ask one more question, then I'm going to open up the audience for questions. So Ian, where can people go for the information that you referred to that's available free for download?
So CISA.gov is our main site. There's a cyber resources hub that we have that goes into much more detail than we've talked about as far as our assessments, our technical services, our exercise support, and all of that. And I know there's a lot of information out there, but we also do chemical security, we do physical security, we do emergency communications, and it's all on the website, CISA.gov.